Chapter 5: The Engine of Evolution.
Natural selection is the process where organisms are better adapted to their environment, leading them to survive and produce more offspring. In Donald Kaufman's experiment with wild mice, it showed that mice survive better when their fur matches the color of the soil in which they live. Since white color is unique among beach mice, they presumably evolved from brown mainland mice when the barrier islands and their white domes were first isolated from the mainland. From there, natural selection would occur. What is involved in creating adaptation by natural selection? There are three things involved in creating an adaptation by natural selection. First is the starting population has to be variable, or not consistent. Referencing back to the mice experiment in the first slide, mice within the population have to show difference in coat colors, otherwise the trait cannot evolve. Second, variation has to have some genetic basis, or called heritability. If there is no genetic difference between the light and dark mice, the light mice may survive better, but coat color difference would not be passed on to the next generation and there would be no evolutionary change. Third, genetic variation must affect an individual's probability of leaving offspring. The most camouflaged mice would leave more copies of their genes. Where does genetic variation come from? It comes from mutations, which are accidental errors in the DNA sequence when the molecule is copied in DNA replication. Genetic variation created by mutation is also widespread. There are mutations in genes, for example, human eye color, blood type, etc. In mutations, they will occur randomly, meaning these mutations will occur whether or not it will benefit the individual. There is no known way to increase the chances that a mutation will provide the needs of the organism. Evolution is the combination of randomness and lawfulness. In the random aspect, the probability of a mutation to occur that produces a wide selection of genetic variants, both good and bad. But the lawful aspect is the natural selection takes place by keeping the good variants in and the bad variants out. Does evolution happen by chance? It is true that genetic variation between individuals are from chance mutations, but natural selection is what helps filters the good and bad traits. Since natural selection allows the better genes to be passed on from generation to generation, it allows individuals to cope with their current living conditions. Mutation and selection tells us how organisms become adapted towards the environment. How selection molds these traits. Every newly evolved trait is a modification from an earlier feature. Each step of the process must allow for a reproductive benefit for organisms who possess it. In order for an adapted trait to remain, it must be able to create a reproductive output of its possessor. Reproduction determines which genes make it for future generations and cause evolution. Passing on a gene requires the individual to survive at the age in which they can produce offspring. Even if the individual does not live after reproducing offspring, the trait will remain in the gene pool. Adaptation. The main goal of adaptation is to directly benefit the individual, not necessarily the group of species. The adaptive trait can even go as far as helping the individual, but harming the species as a whole.
Genetic drift is defined as a random change in the frequency of genes over time. A separate process from natural selection, genetic drift is still considered to be a legitimate type of evolution. Furthermore, the smaller population sizes, the more susceptible they are to genetic drift. A very good example of genetic drift would be the different blood types in the Old Order Amish communities. This is because their communities are so small, they experience a lot of intermarriages. That is to say, they have a very small gene pool. And as we know all too well, a small gene pool of isolated individuals who take to intermarriage would be a prime example of genetic drift at play. An example would be the German Old Order Dunker Societies. The German Old Order Dunker Societies became pivotal in an experiment in the late 1950s because of their strict religious laws. in reference to who they may or may not marry, it was assumed that their population was a closed mating population. When they took blood samples from these dunkers, they noticed that in the span of 220 years, which is not nearly enough time for natural selection to have any sort of meaningful effect, given the generation times of humans, the frequency of blood type A had gone way up. Nearly 60% of the Dunkers had blood type A, while the West German population from which the Dunkers hailed was only 45%. The surrounding U.S. population was only 40%. It is quite evident that the frequency of the A blood type in the Dunkers is an outlier when compared that to the West Germans and their surrounding population. Given the set of reproductive boundaries that the Dunkers face, it is very easy to attribute this deviation from the mean to be due to genetic drift. That is to say, if we imagine that from the original Dunker population, a disproportionate ratio of blood type A's migrated out, this discrepancy can easily be explained. While this example natural selection would be seen as the antithesis of genetic drift. While genetic drift works completely randomly with no accord to fitness, natural selection only works to help fix the advantageous gene. Furthermore, genetic drift's effect can only really be observed in populations with slow generation times and small populations, whereas natural selection best operates on large populations with fast generation times. Drug resistance. Antibiotic resistance in bacteria is an incredible example of natural selection, or the differential survival and reproduction of individuals due to differences in phenotype. Bacterium are an organism with giant population sizes and extremely short generation sizes. Because of these two factors combined, they are the poster child for natural selection. Say, in a population of bacterium, where prior to this experiment they had no selective advantage to penicillin. When penicillin is introduced into the population, every last bacteria will die, aside from whatever lucky ones that happen to have resistance to that antibiotic. Now, due to how fast they multiply, both in time and volume, you will quickly notice that in a few generations, all of the bacterium in question from that colony will now be penicillin resistant. This is a form of selection known as hard selection.
If selection is a process that occurs over a long period, then the question becomes, is there any form of selection that we can see in real time? The answer to that question is yes, but the only selection that would be visible to us would be strong selection, which is a type of selection in which changes evolve very rapidly. And so, of course, in order to see these changes, the ideal attribute that we would want is for species to have short generation times, since the short generation times mean you will be able to observe changes more noticeably. And they would have to be adapting to a new environment so that these changes would be noticeable. One such example is the Galapagos finches in which Peter and Rosemary Grant of Princeton University studied. They noticed that the Galapagos finches all had different beaks ranging from size to length, for correlated with what type of diet they had. Finches with shorter beaks tended to eat small soft seeds. Finches with more narrow and lengthier beaks tended to eat insects. Finches with bigger and stouter beaks tended to eat hard seeds, which would require a stronger, bigger beak to crack open the hard seeds. Prior to the drought in 1977, there was a normal, even distribution of finch beak sizes, with the most abundant being the mean. But after the drought, beak sizes drastically shifted to the right, favoring finches with bigger beaks. For the drought left only the hard seeds to remain, and so natural selection saw this and increased the frequency of finches with bigger beaks in the next generation, for the other finches with the smaller beaks sizes couldn't crack open the harder seeds and died off. Another example is the California wild mustard plant, who suffered a severe 5-year drought in California. Normally, these mustard plants flower later in their flowering time period, but due to the severe drought that they experienced, they began to flower a week earlier than their ancestors did. The reason was that during a drought, soil dried out very quickly, and so if a plant doesn't quickly flower in a drought, they will not be able to leave any descendants behind. Natural selection sees this, and so it was the driving factor that caused the mustard plant to flower much earlier than their ancestors did. The question of if selection can build complexity is a deep and complex one, no pun intended. For we have to ask ourselves first, what is complexity in the first place? Just like how we don't have an exact concrete definition of life, we don't necessarily have a concrete definition of complexity, but rather we usually give it traits that we can then use to compare organisms to see if they are complex or not. Examples include bacteria flagellum, which is composed of dozens of separate proteins that simultaneously work together to move the bacteria in a certain direction. Blood clotting would be considered complex for its mechanism that requires a 16-step process to even occur. Which begs the question, if selection is able to build complexity, what are the benefits does natural selection, quote, see to keep it in a population? Let's take the eye, for example. The eye is a complex organ that benefits an individual by making an individual better able to find food, avoid predators, and navigate around its environment. The question then becomes, is there any proof that the eye is the result of natural selection? One such proof is when Dan Erik Nilsson and Susan Pelger of Lund University in Sweden made a mathematical model that mimicked the course of natural selection on tissues around the structure of an eye. In short, the mimic of natural selection yielded a complex eye. In conclusion, we can provisionally assume that natural selection is the cause of all adaptive evolution, though not of every feature of evolution, since genetic drift can also play a role. Small changes in which forces that are operated on are weak, which can lead to a large and drastic change over time.